The restaurant looked like a place where everything belonged to a different world. Soft golden lights hung from the ceiling, reflecting gently on polished tables. The air carried the quiet sound of glasses touching and low conversations that never grew too loud. Everything felt controlled, calm, and expensive. People who came here dressed with care. Their clothes were neat, their voices measured, and their movements slow and confident. They didn't rush. They didn't look around too much. It was as if they already knew they belonged. Among them moved the staff, dressed in simple uniforms that blended into the background. They worked quickly but quietly, making sure everything stayed perfect without drawing attention to themselves. One of them was a young waitress. She walked between tables with steady steps, carrying trays, taking orders, and offering polite smiles. Her movements were smooth, practiced over time. She didn't interrupt conversations unless needed. She didn't linger. She did her job well, but like most of the staff, she was almost invisible. People looked past her, not at her. But if someone had taken a moment to really notice, they might have seen something different. There was a calm focus in her eyes. Not tired, not empty, just quiet, like she was always thinking about something else beyond the room. Every now and then, as she moved across the restaurant, her gaze would shift toward one corner. That corner held a grand piano. It stood near a large window, its black surface shining under the lights. A soft melody often came from it, played by a man who performed there every evening. His music filled the space without demanding attention. It simply existed, adding to the atmosphere. Most guests barely noticed the piano unless something went wrong. To them, it was just part of the background, like the lights or the walls. But not to her. Whenever she passed by, even if just for a second, her eyes would flick toward it. Sometimes she slowed down without realizing. Sometimes her fingers adjusted slightly, as if remembering something. She never stopped. She never stared too long. But the connection was there. It showed in small ways, like how she could tell when a wrong note was played, even if no one else reacted. Her expression would change for just a moment, barely noticeable, before she returned to her usual calm face. Or how she seemed to time her steps with the rhythm of the music, moving through the room as if the piano guided her pace. No one paid attention to these things. To everyone else, she was just a waitress doing her job. That evening was busier than usual. A special gathering had been planned, and many important guests had arrived. The tables were full, and the air carried a little more energy than normal. Still controlled, still quiet, but heavier, like something important was happening. The manager walked around more often, checking everything carefully. The staff moved faster, making sure no detail was missed. The waitress worked without complaint. She moved from one table to another, balancing trays, remembering orders, responding politely to every request. A man at one table asked for a change in his order, speaking without even looking at her. She nodded and wrote it down. Another guest waved slightly, signaling for water. She noticed immediately and brought it without delay. Someone dropped a fork. She picked it up and replaced it before anyone else reacted. She didn't expect thanks. She didn't wait for it either. Her work was quiet, steady, and consistent. But even in the middle of all this, her attention still drifted, just for seconds at a time, toward the piano. The man playing it that night wore a formal suit. His posture was straight, his movements confident. His fingers moved across the keys with skill, producing a melody that flowed smoothly through the room. The guests didn't clap or react. That wasn't the kind of place where people stopped to show appreciation during dinner. The music was meant to exist in the background. Still, it mattered. And it mattered to her more than anyone else in that room. At one point, as she passed by with an empty tray, the pianist made a small mistake. It was quick, just one note slightly off, but it was there. Most people didn't notice. She did. Her steps paused for a fraction of a second. Her eyes shifted. There was no judgment in her expression, just awareness. Then she continued walking, as if nothing had happened. Later, she stood near a service station organizing cutlery. The piano continued playing in the distance. For a brief moment, her fingers moved slightly in the air, almost like she was following the notes. It wasn't something she was fully aware of. It just happened. A coworker nearby noticed her stillness. "Busy night," the coworker said quietly. She nodded with a small smile. "Yes, that event crowd is always like this." Another nod. "It's okay." She didn't say much more. She rarely did. It wasn't that she didn't have thoughts. She had many, but she kept them inside, choosing silence over unnecessary words. The coworker moved away to attend another table. She stayed for a second longer, then picked up a tray and returned to the floor. As the night continued, the restaurant became even more lively. Not loud but fuller. More conversations, more movement, more pressure on the staff. The manager's voice could occasionally be heard giving quiet instructions. "Make sure table 3 gets their order quickly. Check on the guests near the window. Stay sharp." She followed every instruction without hesitation. At one table, a group of guests laughed softly, discussing something important. At another, a couple sat quietly, focused on their meal. No one looked at her long enough to wonder who she was. And yet, she carried something with her that didn't belong to this place. Something deeper than the role she played. At one moment, she walked past the piano again, this time closer than usual. The pianist's hands moved gracefully across the keys. Her eyes lingered just a little longer. In that second, something changed in her expression. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't regret. It was something quieter. Memory. Then someone called for her, and the moment ended. She turned immediately, her face returning to its calm, professional look. "Yes, sir," she said politely, stepping toward the table. The night moved on like that, small moments hidden inside routine. Serving, walking, listening, observing, and always somewhere in the background, the piano. If anyone had asked her about it, she probably would have smiled and said it was just music. But it wasn't just music. Not to her. For her, it was something she understood without needing to explain. Something that stayed with her, even when she tried to ignore it. Something that didn't belong to the life she was living now, but hadn't left her either. As the evening slowly moved toward its peak, the restaurant felt fuller than ever. Glasses clinked softly. Conversations continued. The piano played on. And the waitress kept moving through it all, unnoticed by most, yet quietly connected to something far greater than anyone around her could see. The kind of connection that doesn't need attention. The kind that waits. And somewhere deep inside, without anyone knowing, that quiet connection was still alive, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The night did not slow down after that. If anything, it grew heavier. More guests arrived, and the restaurant felt tighter, even though nothing had changed in the space itself. The air carried a quiet pressure, the kind that made every movement matter a little more. Staff moved faster but still with control. No one wanted to make a mistake, especially on a night like this. The waitress continued her work without pause. Her steps were steady, her hands careful, her attention sharp. She didn't rush in a way that looked messy. She had learned how to move quickly while still appearing calm. But inside, her thoughts were not as still as her actions. The sound of the piano stayed with her, following her from table to table. Even when she was focused on taking orders or carrying trays, a part of her mind listened closely. It wasn't just listening for mistakes. It was remembering. At one table, a guest asked her about a dish on the menu. She explained it clearly, answering every question without hesitation. The guest nodded and placed the order. "Thank you," the guest said, already looking back at the menu. She gave a small polite smile and stepped away. As she turned, the piano shifted into a slower piece. The notes were softer now, more spaced out, almost like a quiet conversation. Her chest tightened slightly, not in pain, in recognition. She had heard something like this before, a long time ago. For a brief second, the restaurant around her faded just a little. The voices, the lights, the movement, they all stepped back. In their place came a memory. A smaller room, a simple upright piano, a window with sunlight coming through. Her hands, younger, resting on the keys. A voice nearby, calm and patient, guiding her. Don't rush. Let the note breathe. She blinked, and the memory disappeared as quickly as it came. She was back in the restaurant, standing near a table, holding an empty tray. Someone called for her again, and she moved forward without delay. The past never stayed long. It visited in moments, then left. She had learned not to hold on to it too tightly. Still, it never really went away. As the evening continued, the pressure in the restaurant grew more noticeable. The special guests at the center of the event were being given extra attention. Their table was large, surrounded by quiet respect. The manager personally checked on them more than once. Everything had to be perfect. The waitress was assigned to assist near that area. It meant more work, more responsibility, but she didn't complain. She simply adjusted like she always did. At one point, she stood near the service station again, preparing drinks. The sound of the piano reached her clearly from where she was. This time, without realizing it, her fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the counter, moving slowly, almost as if they were pressing invisible keys. A coworker noticed and gave a small curious look. "You like the music?" the coworker asked. She paused, her fingers stopping instantly. "Yes," she said simply. "You always seem to notice it more than the rest of us." She didn't answer right away. Then she gave a small nod. "Maybe." The coworker smiled lightly. "I can barely tell when it changes." She gave a soft, almost distant smile. "It changes a lot." The coworker laughed quietly. "I'll take your word for it." And just like that, the conversation ended. But the moment stayed with her. It was rare for anyone to notice anything about her beyond her work. Even something small felt different. She picked up the drinks and walked back toward the tables. The pianist continued playing, moving from one piece to another with practiced ease. The guests remained mostly focused on their conversations, barely reacting to the music. But for her, every note mattered. Each one carried something familiar, something she once understood deeply, something she still understood, even if she no longer allowed herself to fully step into it. Later in the evening, she was clearing a table near the piano. It brought her closer than usual, close enough to see the pianist's hands clearly. They moved quickly, confidently, without hesitation. She watched for just a second longer than she should have. Not with envy, not with regret, but with quiet awareness. She noticed the way the fingers curved, the way the wrist stayed relaxed, the way each note connected to the next. Her own fingers twitched slightly, almost responding on their own. Then she looked away and continued clearing the table. She knew her place. She had accepted it a long time ago. Life didn't always go the way people planned. Sometimes things changed. Sometimes dreams were set aside, not because they weren't important, but because something else became more necessary. For her, that change had come slowly, not all at once. First, it was small. Less time for practice. More responsibilities at home. Then fewer opportunities. Then none at all. The piano became something distant. Something she still loved, but no longer belonged to. Or at least that's what she told herself. The reality was more complicated. Because even now, standing in a busy restaurant, carrying trays and serving guests, the connection was still there. It hadn't disappeared. It had only been quiet. Waiting. The night continued to build toward its peak. The special guests were now fully settled, their conversations flowing smoothly. The staff worked carefully around them, making sure nothing disturbed the atmosphere. The manager looked slightly less tense, but still alert. Everything had to remain perfect until the end. The waitress moved between tables, her focus never slipping. But something inside her felt different now. The music had changed again. It was stronger this time, more confident, more alive. It filled the space in a way that was harder to ignore. Even some of the guests began to notice, their conversations pausing for a second longer than before. She felt it too, not just in her ears, in her chest, in her hands. It was as if the sound was pulling something forward from deep inside her, something she had kept hidden for a long time. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus only on her work. But it wasn't easy. At one moment, she stopped near the edge of the room, holding a tray, waiting for a clear path to move forward. The piano was directly in front of her. The melody slowed down again, soft but powerful. Her eyes lifted. This time, she didn't look away immediately. For a few seconds, she simply stood there, watching, listening, feeling. The rest of the room continued around her. Voices, movement, quiet laughter. But she was still, completely still. Then, as quickly as it began, the moment broke. Someone stepped into her path, and she moved aside. The tray in her hands reminded her where she was, what she was doing. She took a quiet breath and continued forward. Back to work, back to routine. But something had shifted. It was small, almost invisible, yet it was there. The kind of shift that doesn't show on the outside, but changes everything on the inside. As the night moved closer to its most important moment, no one in the room realized that something else was building quietly alongside it. Not in the guests, not in the manager, but in her. A feeling she had kept buried. A part of her she had pushed aside. Slowly, gently, it was beginning to rise again. And she didn't know yet what that would lead to. But for the first time in a long while, the distance between her and the piano didn't feel as large as it once did. It still stood in the same place. She still wore the same uniform. The world around her hadn't changed. But something inside her had started to move. And once something like that begins, it doesn't easily go back to silence. The evening had reached a point where everything felt carefully balanced. The guests were settled. The conversations flowed smoothly. And the soft music from the piano filled the space just enough to hold everything together. It was the kind of moment the restaurant aimed for every night, but especially on important occasions like this one. The staff moved with precision. Every step, every gesture, every word was controlled. No one wanted to disturb the atmosphere. The waitress continued her work as she had all evening. Quiet, focused, almost invisible. But inside her, that quiet shift from earlier had not faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. The music no longer felt like something in the background. It felt closer now, louder in a way that didn't come from volume. It reached her even when she tried to focus on something else. At one table, she placed a dish carefully in front of a guest. "Your order," she said softly. The guest nodded without looking up. She stepped back, her attention already moving to the next task. Then it happened. First, it was small. The piano slowed. A note lingered longer than it should have. Then another. The flow of the music broke for just a second. A few guests glanced toward the piano, not fully aware of what was wrong, but sensing a change. The waitress noticed immediately. Her head turned slightly, her eyes focusing on the pianist. Something was off. The man at the piano shifted in his seat. His hands hovered over the keys for a moment longer than usual. Then he pressed a few notes again, trying to continue. But the rhythm was gone. The smooth flow from before had disappeared, replaced by hesitation. A quiet tension spread through the room. The kind that people don't talk about but feel. The manager noticed too. From across the room, he looked toward the piano with a tight expression. He began moving quickly, but still carefully, trying not to draw attention. The pianist stopped completely this time. His hands dropped slightly, and he leaned back, looking uncomfortable. For a moment there was no music. The silence felt louder than anything that had played before. Some guests paused their conversations. Others looked around, unsure of what was happening. The atmosphere began to slip. The manager reached the piano and bent slightly, speaking in a low voice to the pianist. The waitress couldn't hear the words, but she could see the concern in their expressions. Something wasn't right. The pianist shook his head slightly. The manager's face tightened. This was not part of the plan. The special event, the important guests, the carefully built atmosphere. Everything depended on details like this. And now one of those details had broken. The waitress stood still for a moment, watching. Her tray felt heavier in her hands, even though it was nearly empty. Around her, the room began to shift. Conversations grew uncertain. Some guests tried to continue as if nothing had happened, but the absence of music made the space feel incomplete. The manager straightened up, looking around quickly. He needed a solution, and he needed it fast. He signaled to another staff member, speaking quickly. The staff member nodded and rushed away, likely searching for a replacement or trying to fix the situation. But time was passing. Every second of silence made the atmosphere weaker. The waitress felt something rise inside her. Not suddenly, not loudly, but clearly. It was the same feeling from earlier, now stronger. She looked at the piano again, the empty space behind it, the keys waiting. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She looked down at her hands. For a brief second, they didn't feel like the hands of a waitress carrying trays. They felt familiar in a different way. She took a small step forward, then stopped. Her mind pushed back immediately. This wasn't her place. This wasn't her role. There were other people who should handle this. People with titles, with recognition, with permission. Not her. She looked around. The manager was still trying to manage the situation, speaking quietly but urgently with another staff member. The pianist remained seated, clearly unable to continue. The silence stretched on. Another step, then another. She didn't fully realize she was moving until she was closer to the piano than she had ever been during her shift. A voice inside her told her to stop, to go back, to return to her work. But another voice, quieter yet stronger, told her something else. She reached the edge of the open space near the piano. The manager noticed her. At first, his expression showed confusion. Why was she there? Go back to your section, he said quickly under his breath, not wanting to draw attention. She hesitated. Her hands tightened slightly around the tray. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, but steady. I can play. The manager blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. What? I can play? She repeated, still calm. For a second, he just stared at her. The idea didn't make sense to him. A waitress? Here? Now? This wasn't a small moment. This was a high-level event, filled with important guests. This was not the time to take risks. No, he said quickly. This is not. But he stopped, because there were no other options in front of him. The replacement hadn't arrived. The pianist couldn't continue, and the silence was growing heavier by the second. He looked around the room. Guests were starting to notice more clearly now. Something had to be done. His eyes returned to her. She stood there, not pushing, not insisting, just waiting. Calm, certain. There was no panic in her face, no desperation, just quiet confidence. That made him pause. Have you played before? He asked, lowering his voice. She nodded once. Yes. That was all she said. No long explanation. No attempt to prove herself. Just one word. The manager hesitated again. This could go wrong. Very wrong. But doing nothing was already going wrong. He took a breath, then made a decision. Fine, he said quietly. But keep it soft. Just fill the space. She nodded. He stepped aside. The path to the piano was clear. For a moment, everything around her seemed to fade slightly. The voices, the movement, the pressure, they all stepped back. There was only the piano now. She placed the tray on a nearby surface. Her hands were free. She walked forward slowly, each step steady. No rush, no hesitation. The pianist stood up from the bench, giving her a curious look as he moved aside. She gave a small, respectful nod. Then she sat down. The bench felt different from what she remembered. Or maybe she had changed. Her hands hovered above the keys. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The room was still. Some guests watched openly now. Others pretended not to, but their attention had shifted. A waitress at the piano. It didn't make sense. But there she was, sitting in front of it, ready. Her fingers lowered slightly, not touching yet, just feeling the space. A breath, slow, steady. Then, the first note, soft, clear, and completely certain. It didn't sound like hesitation. It didn't sound like someone filling silence. It sounded like something that belonged. The note lingered in the air, gentle but strong enough to be noticed. A few conversations stopped immediately. Heads turned. Her second note followed. Then a third. The melody began to form. Simple at first. Careful. But not unsure. Her hands moved with a natural rhythm, as if they had been waiting for this moment. The room grew quieter. Not because she demanded it, but because something about the sound pulled attention without asking. The manager stood still, watching. The doubt in his expression began to fade. The waitress, who had been invisible just minutes ago, now sat at the center of the room. And with every note she played, something began to change. Not just in the music, but in the way the room felt. The silence that had once been uncomfortable was now different. It was focused, alive, and she was no longer just filling the space. She was shaping it. What had started as a risk was becoming something else entirely. Something no one in that room had expected. And she hadn't even begun to show everything yet. The first few notes settled into the room like something gentle but certain. They didn't rush and they didn't try to impress. They simply existed, clear and steady, as if they had always belonged there. At first, people didn't fully react. A few guests glanced toward the piano, curious but unsure. After all, they had just seen a waitress sit down in place of the pianist. It didn't match their expectations. But the sound made them pause. Her hands moved slowly, almost carefully, as if she was testing the space again after a long time. Each note followed the next with quiet control. There was no hesitation anymore, only a calm rhythm that began to grow. The waitress didn't look around. She didn't check if anyone was watching. Her eyes rested softly on the keys, her focus steady and deep. It was as if the rest of the room had disappeared for her. For the first time that night, she wasn't thinking about orders or trays or instructions. She was simply playing. The melody started to take shape more clearly. What began as something soft and simple slowly gained depth. The notes connected more smoothly, building into something that carried emotion without needing words. A man at one table stopped speaking mid-sentence. He tilted his head slightly, listening. At another table, a woman slowly lowered her glass, her attention shifting completely toward the piano. The quiet conversations around the room began to fade, one by one. No one told them to stop. They just did. The manager stood near the side, watching closely. At first, he had been tense, ready to step in if something went wrong. But now his expression softened. The worry in his face slowly turned into something else. Surprise. The waitress's fingers moved more freely now. The earlier caution had faded. Her hands no longer hovered, they flowed. The melody grew stronger. Not louder in a harsh way, but fuller. Carried feeling. Real feeling. The kind that doesn't come from practice alone, but from something deeper. Something lived. Her posture remained calm. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing steady. There was no sign of panic, no sign that she was out of place. In that moment, she didn't look like a waitress sitting at a piano. She looked like someone who belonged there. Someone who had always belonged there. The guests began to notice more clearly now. This was not just someone filling silence. This was something else. A man leaned slightly forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on her hands. Another guest exchanged a quiet look with someone at their table, both silently acknowledging what they were hearing. The music continued to build. It wasn't fast or flashy. It didn't try to demand attention, but it held it, completely. The waitress's fingers moved across the keys with confidence now, pressing each note with intention. There was a natural flow in her playing, like she wasn't forcing anything. Felt honest. That was what made it different. Honest. The kind of sound that made people feel something without knowing exactly why. She shifted slightly on the bench, her hands moving into a new part of the piece. The tone changed, becoming deeper, more emotional. A quiet heaviness filled the room. Not uncomfortable, but meaningful. It was the kind of music that made people reflect, even if just for a moment. Some guests looked down at their tables, lost in thought. Others kept their eyes on her, unable to look away. The room, which had once been filled with scattered conversations, was now connected by a single sound. Her sound. The waitress didn't notice any of it. Or maybe she did, but it didn't matter. Because she was no longer playing for the room. She was playing from within herself. Every note carried something personal, something real, something that had been quiet for a long time. And now it was being heard. The pianist who had stepped away stood near the side, watching with a quiet expression. There was no frustration in his face, no irritation, only respect. He could see it clearly. This was not luck. This was not coincidence. This was skill. And more than that, it was connection. The waitress moved into a softer section again, her fingers slowing, letting each note breathe. The pace dropped, but the feeling stayed strong. The room remained silent. No one wanted to interrupt. Even the smallest sounds, cutlery, glasses, seemed to pause. It was as if the entire space had agreed, without speaking, to listen. The manager let out a slow breath, one he didn't realize he had been holding. His eyes stayed on her, but now with a different kind of focus. He wasn't worried anymore. He was watching something unexpected unfold. Something rare. The music began to rise again, gently at first, then more clearly. It built in layers, each note adding to the one before it. The waitress's hands moved faster now, but still controlled. Still precise. There was no chaos in her playing. Only purpose. Her expression remained calm, but there was a quiet intensity in her eyes now. Something deeper had come forward. Something she had kept hidden for a long time. And now it was no longer hidden. The guests could feel it. Even if they didn't understand it. Even if they couldn't explain it. They felt it. A man who had been checking his phone earlier now had it resting on the table. Forgotten. A group that had been quietly discussing business had completely stopped, their attention fully captured. Even the staff, moving carefully around the edges of the room, slowed down slightly, listening as they worked. The music filled every corner. Not loudly, but completely. The waitress reached a turning point in the piece. A moment where everything shifted. Her hands paused for just a fraction of a second. Then continued. And in that continuation, something changed. The emotion in the music deepened. It became stronger, more expressive, more alive. This was no longer just a performance. It was a story told without words. A story that everyone in the room could feel, even if they didn't know the details behind it. The waitress remained focused, her connection to the piano unbroken. She wasn't thinking about how she looked. She wasn't thinking about who was watching. She wasn't thinking about what would happen after this. She was simply there, in the moment, in the music, and the room followed her, completely. By now, no one saw her as just a waitress. That idea had quietly disappeared. In its place was something else. Something real. Something undeniable. The music began to slow again, gently moving toward a close. The notes softened, becoming lighter, more spaced out. But the feeling remained. Strong. Clear. The final notes approached, not rushed, not forced. Each one placed carefully, meaningfully. The room held its breath, waiting, listening. And as her fingers pressed the last key, letting the final note linger in the air, there was a moment of pure silence. Not empty, but full. The kind of silence that only comes after something truly felt. And in that silence, everything had already changed. The final note faded slowly, almost like it didn't want to leave the room. For a brief moment, everything stayed completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. It was the kind of silence that felt full, not empty. The music had ended, but something it left behind was still there, hanging quietly in the air. The waitress kept her hands resting lightly on the keys. She didn't pull them away immediately. Her breathing was steady, but her chest rose a little deeper than before. She blinked once, as if returning from somewhere far away. Then she slowly lifted her fingers. That was when the room reacted. At first, it was just one person. A single clap, soft but clear. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the sound grew. What started as a few quiet claps turned into something much stronger. People straightened in their seats. Heads nodded. Hands came together again and again. The applause filled the room. It wasn't polite. It wasn't forced. It was real. Several guests began to stand, almost without thinking. One by one, more followed until a large part of the room was on their feet. The same people who had barely noticed her earlier were now looking directly at her. Not past her. Her. The waitress remained seated for a second longer, clearly not expecting this. Her eyes moved slightly across the room, taking in the reaction. There was no smile at first, just quiet surprise. Then, slowly, a small, natural smile appeared. Not big, not dramatic, just real. She stood up from the bench, turning slightly toward the room. Her posture remained simple, almost humble, as if she still didn't fully see herself the way others now did. The applause continued. Some guests nodded in appreciation. Others exchanged impressed looks. A few leaned toward each other, speaking quietly but with clear excitement. That was unexpected. Where did that come from? Was she part of the event? Questions moved quietly through the room, but no one had clear answers. The manager stepped forward, his expression completely different from earlier. The tension that had been there before was gone. In its place was something closer to pride, and a bit of disbelief. He approached her, clapping as well, though his eyes stayed focused on her with curiosity. That was... He paused briefly, searching for the right word. Remarkable. She lowered her gaze slightly, her smile soft. Thank you, she said quietly. The applause began to settle, though the energy in the room remained high. Guests slowly returned to their seats, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Before, the room had been calm and controlled. Now it felt alive, connected. People were no longer just focused on their own tables. There was a shared feeling moving through the space, something that had not been there earlier. The pianist who had stepped aside earlier walked closer, his expression calm and respectful. He gave a small nod. That was beautifully done, he said. She nodded back politely. Thank you. There was no long conversation. None was needed. The respect was clear. The waitress stepped away from the piano, her steps slow but steady. As she moved back toward the service area, she could feel the difference immediately. Eyes followed her, not in a negative way, not with judgment, but with attention. People noticed her now, really noticed her. At one table, a guest stopped her as she passed. Excuse me, the guest said gently. She turned, her usual calm expression returning. Yes, that performance. It was truly something special. She paused for a second, then gave a small nod. Thank you. The guest smiled, clearly impressed. You should be on that stage, not carrying trays. She didn't respond right away, not because she didn't hear it, but because she didn't know how to answer. So she simply gave a polite smile and moved on. At another table, someone else looked at her with curiosity. You've been hiding that talent all this time? The person said with a light tone. She shook her head slightly. I just work here. The answer was simple, but it carried more than it said. As she reached the service station, a few of her coworkers looked at her differently now. Not just as another member of the staff, but as someone they hadn't fully known before. One of them let out a quiet breath. I didn't know you could play like that. She placed her hands lightly on the counter. I used to, she said softly. Used to? The coworker repeated, surprised. She didn't explain further. Instead, she picked up a tray again, as if returning to something familiar. But even that felt different now. The manager approached once more, this time with a calmer expression. For now, go back to your section, he said. But his tone was no longer strict. It was thoughtful. She nodded. Of course. As she stepped back onto the floor, the restaurant continued, but not in the same way as before. Conversations picked up again, but they were lighter now, more open. Some guests still glanced toward the piano, as if expecting more. Others spoke quietly about what they had just witnessed. The waitress resumed her work, taking orders, serving dishes, clearing tables, but nothing felt exactly the same. Not for her, and not for the room. At one moment, as she poured water into a glass, her hands remained steady, just as they had always been. But inside, something had shifted. Not in a loud or overwhelming way, just enough to be felt. The distance she had placed between herself and the piano for so long didn't feel as solid anymore. It had been there for years, built slowly, piece by piece. But tonight, something had broken through it. Not completely, but enough. She moved to another table, placing a dish carefully. "Enjoy your meal," she said. The guest looked up at her with a small smile. "We already are," the guest replied, then added. "And we enjoyed the music too." She gave a slight nod and stepped away. As the night continued, the piano remained quiet for a while. No one rushed to fill it again. It was as if the room needed time to settle after what had happened. The manager glanced toward it once or twice, thinking. The original pianist stood nearby, waiting calmly. Eventually, he returned to the bench. But when he began to play again, something felt different. Not worse, just different. The room listened in a new way now, because they had already heard something unexpected, something real. And that kind of moment doesn't disappear easily. The waitress continued her work until the night began to slow. Guests started to leave one by one. Some glanced back at the piano before stepping out. Some glanced at her. Some did both. The energy of the evening stayed, even as the crowd thinned. And through it all, she remained the same on the outside. Calm, quiet, focused. But inside, something had clearly changed. Something that had been silent for a long time had finally been heard. And now that it had been heard, could not simply go back to being ignored. By the time the last guests began to leave, the restaurant felt quieter than it had all night. Not empty, but settled. The lights still glowed softly, the tables were still neatly arranged, and the staff continued their work. But something about the space had changed. The energy from earlier hadn't disappeared. It had simply softened, like a memory that was still fresh. The waitress moved between tables, clearing plates and collecting glasses. Her steps were the same as always, careful and steady. On the outside, nothing about her had changed. But people still looked at her differently. A couple near the door paused before leaving. The man turned slightly toward her. "You played beautifully," he said. She gave a small nod. "Thank you." The woman beside him smiled warmly. "It stayed with us." The waitress didn't respond right away. She simply returned the smile, soft and genuine. "Good night," she said. "Good night," they replied, then walked out. She watched them leave for a second, then turned back to her work. The staff had started their closing routine. Plates were stacked, tables wiped down, chairs adjusted. The quiet rhythm of the end of a long shift began to take over. From across the room, the manager watched her for a moment before walking over. "You handled tonight well," he said. She looked up. "Thank you." He paused, then added, "Not just the service." She understood what he meant, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she waited. "You never mentioned you could play," he continued. She lowered her gaze slightly. "It wasn't important." The manager studied her expression, trying to understand. "Not important?" he repeated. She shook her head gently. "I had other things to focus on." There was no sadness in her voice, just honesty. The manager didn't push further. He nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "it mattered tonight." She gave a small nod in return. "Yes." For a moment they stood in silence. Then he spoke again, his tone more thoughtful. "If you ever want to play again here, we can arrange something." The offer hung in the air. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't formal. But it was real. She looked at him, surprised. Not in a big way, but enough to show in her eyes. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. "That's fair," he replied. He gave a small nod and walked away, leaving her standing there for a moment longer than usual. Play again. The words stayed with her. She returned to clearing the table in front of her, but her movements slowed slightly. Play again. It had been a long time since anyone had said something like that to her. Not as a memory, not as something from the past, but as something possible. As the night continued, the restaurant grew emptier. Most of the guests had left. Only a few tables remained, finishing their meals or enjoying quiet conversations. The piano stood still again, silent, but not forgotten. She found herself looking at it more than once. Not with distance this time, but with something closer, something familiar. When her tasks were finally complete, she stepped back toward the service area. The other staff members were finishing up as well, some talking quietly, others focused on their work. One of them glanced at her. "That was a big moment tonight," the coworker said. She gave a small smile. "It was unexpected." The coworker nodded. "You should do that more often." She didn't answer, not because she disagreed, but because she didn't know yet. The idea felt new, uncertain, but not impossible. After a while, the manager announced that the shift was ending. "Good work, everyone," he said. The staff began to gather their things, preparing to leave. The waitress moved slowly, not rushing to go. Her eyes drifted toward the piano again. The room was almost empty now. Quiet. Still. She hesitated. Then, without thinking too much, she walked toward it. Her steps were light, almost careful, as if she didn't want to disturb the calm around her. When she reached the bench, she didn't sit right away. She stood there for a second, looking at the keys. Up close, they looked the same as always. Simple. Familiar. She placed her fingers lightly on them, not pressing, just resting. The feeling returned instantly, not forced, not distant, just there. She sat down slowly. No one stopped her. No one questioned her. Most of the staff were busy finishing their tasks, and those who noticed didn't interrupt. She took a quiet breath, then pressed a single note. It echoed softly in the empty room, different from before, more personal. She played another, then another. This time there was no audience, no pressure, no expectations, just her and the piano. The melody that followed was softer than the one she had played earlier in the night. Simpler, but just as real. Her hands moved naturally, without hesitation. The space around her felt calm, almost protective, as if the room itself was allowing her this moment. She didn't play for long, just enough. Enough to feel it again. Enough to understand something she hadn't fully realized before. That what she thought she had left behind was still with her. She stopped gently, letting the last note fade. Then she sat still for a moment, thinking, not deeply, not heavily, just quietly. Then she stood up. Her expression had changed slightly, not in a dramatic way, but enough. There was something clearer in her eyes now, something decided. She stepped away from the piano and picked up her bag. As she walked toward the exit, the manager noticed her. "Heading out?" he asked. "Yes," he nodded. "Good night." "Good night," she replied. She stepped outside. The air felt cooler, fresher after the long night. The street was quiet, the world moving at a slower pace than inside the restaurant. She paused for a moment, looking ahead. There was no big plan, no sudden change, but there was something new, possibility, something that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had been there all along, just waiting. She began to walk. Her steps were steady, just like always. But this time they carried something different. Not just routine, not just responsibility, but a quiet sense of direction. The kind that doesn't rush, the kind that grows slowly. Behind her, the restaurant lights continued to glow. Inside, the piano sat still again, but not forgotten, not anymore, and neither was she.